Madonna does. That's made up fake-ass Kabbalah. Real Kabbalah is what we're going to be talking about here, sort of. So the Sephirot are 10 emanations of God that descend into this world. The Kabbalistic creation myth, which is more or less, it's a metaphorical retelling of the first couple chapters of Genesis. God is everywhere and everything because God is infinite. And that means God cannot create anything because there's nowhere to do it. So God retracts himself, his light, in order to create a region of darkness. But then there's just God and darkness kind of sucks. So he trickles a little bit of the divine light into the darkness. And that forms the 10 emanations of the Sephirot. Sephirot means vessels, and these are vessels that he created to catch and hold the light. Then they broke. But the Sephirot represent a bunch of things. They represent the path from man to God, because just as God trickled the light down into the darkness and created the world, we can climb up it to come close to God. It is the process of creation, not only the divine creation of the world, but all human creation, whether you're writing a story or building a house, is a reflection and a sort of like a child playing let's pretend at their dad's job. It's a reflection of God's act of creating the world. And it's a map of the human soul. Each of the individual Sephirah represents a name of God, a body part, an element of the soul, and a stage in the process of creation. As I said, there are 10, but thanks to the fact that this is old and mystical and different people have come up with different systems of mapping this, there are actually a grand total of 11 Sephirot. Maps which have Keter, the crown, do not have Da'at, the abyss, and vice versa. So let's talk about uses of this in various anime, and most especially in NGE. This is the most famous diagram of the Tree of Life, which is one of the, well, not specifically the appearance in NGE, but the diagram is probably the most famous diagram of the Sephirot. It's the Sephirot representing the Tree of Life. And it shows up in the opening credits of every episode of Evangelion. And then in End of Eva, it shows up upside down. Now, what does it mean? I mean, its presence here is really obvious. Shinji is in the process of destroying the world and ascending humanity to their primordial original state of nigh to godhood. So the whole Tree of Life ascending to God thing makes perfect sense. But why is it upside down? I can think of 2 possibilities here. 3 if you count it means nothing, but that's boring, so we're going to ignore it. One is that it is upside down because the Sephirot represent the path to, or the process of creation, and here we are at the moment of ultimate destruction. So flip them over. The other possibility I can think of is that they are, Sele is at this moment, trying to create a god. So in effect, they're trying to pull God down to earth. So instead of being the path by which man climbs up, it's the path by which God gets pulled down.
On the tree line thing, another graphical interpretation narrative would be Alec Moore's Promethea, which really does get into a whole he gets off into a dissertation of the whole ascension into the tree of life.
Yeah. I will have to check that out. I've not yet gotten to that one. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other uses of Sephirotic imagery. As I mentioned, each of the individual Sephirot represents something. One of the ones that I think is most significant to NGE is Gebera. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Which represents the left arm and the quality of strength. Now, has anybody else noticed that Shinji is constantly staring at his left arm? Has anybody else noticed that the angels are constantly trying to destroy Ava 1's left arm. You noticed?
Yeah.
Awesome. And Ray's left arm falls off in instrumentality. So what does the left arm symbolize? Well, it symbolizes strength, but it's a very specific kind of strength. The right arm represents the ability to take everything good in the world and bring it into yourself. It's the arm you use to embrace your friends. It's the arm you use to gather up the goodness in the world and bring it into your heart. The left arm is the arm that carries your shield. It is the arm you use to ward off what is bad, to keep away what does not belong as part of you. It is the strength with which you assert your identity against the world. The angels are trying to tear that off so that they can do what they're doing later in the series of trying to get to the pilot's minds. Ray's left arm falls off in instrumentality at the moment at which humanity's ability to assert their identity is being erased. And Shinji is constantly staring at his left arm. Well, I would say you can make a pretty good case that he's obsessed with keeping away the bad stuff. So, is this intentional? Don't care. It's kind of cool. It's consistent whether it's intentional or not. Another significant Sephiroth for NGE is Tiferet, the torso, which represents beauty. That's where Ava 1 is sitting right now. The goal of Tiferet, because when you're trying to ascend the path to God, you have to meditate on each one and achieve a particular goal before you can rise to the next one. The goal of Tiferet is the development of the human being to his greatest potential. The development of the human being to his greatest potential. Shinji God. That's actually really, really scary. Shinji makes a much worse God than Haruhi and Monica.
Morgan Freeman any day.
If God doesn't sound like
But the thing is, Morgan Freeman is not God. Morgan Freeman is Metatron.
Yes.
Morgan Freeman is the voice of God. And I will be deeply disappointed if that turns out not to be the case.
Might be okay if it's Alan Rickman.
That would be acceptable.
Yeah.
Let's talk about FMA, where it is out.
Quick question. Wasn't the Tree of Life also part of Buddhism mythology?
There is a tree of life in Buddhist mythology, but it is very different from the Kabbalistic tree of life. Now,
mythology too, but there's also one in Norse mythology that's certainly not the same.
there is also one in Norse mythology, but that's more the tree of the world. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the guy who promised he would rudely interrupt my pen. Although, and I'm getting into a little bit of a tangent here, right at the time when the Silk Road was forming, the entire Jewish population of the world was living right on top of it. There was a lot, during the period in which Kabbalah was first emerging, there was a lot of traffic, not a lot, but there was significant traffic between the Roman Empire, India, and China. And Israel was right at the center, so any ideas that got passed with that trade would pass right through it. Just putting that out there. So anyway, another depiction of the Sephiroth, this one much more literally the Tree of Life. You can see it's rooted in the heavens, and then it's got all these branches coming down, and then angel feathers growing at the top for some reason. Or top or bottom, depends on how you look at it. This appears on Ed's Gate. It is, of course, the Tree of Life, which he trades to bring Al back to life. It is statute of limitations, people. It's been like a year.
Sorry, I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Okay, Snape kills Dumbledore, Kamina dies, it was his sled, Luke is Darth Vader's son.
Hey, hold on now.
Sephiroth kills Ares.
Oh, yes, and Jesus dies, but then he comes back.
Today.
Never saw it.
Sauron dies.
Sauron does indeed... Actually, no, Sauron does not die. Sauron is an unkillable god. He just gets rendered powerless. Sauron dies. Don't get me started on Tolkien. I could give like 8 panels in a row on that.
Okay.
Now, and then the other thing is, it is of course his connection to the divine. It's his ability to do alchemy, which is why I know that this is completely intentional, because alchemy took a lot from Kabbalah, and the mangaka of FNA, whose name I'm blanking on, definitely studied alchemy for reals. There's a lot of she clearly felt free to change anything she felt like to make the story more interesting or more visually impressive, but she also clearly knew what she was doing. And finally, Father's Gate has absolutely, everyone in the series has an image on their gate. Al's is an illustration from a book by Paracelsus, whose real name was von Hohenheim. And everyone has and everyone else has an illustration which is much harder to see, and I'm not sure, but I think they're also alchemical or Kabbalistic diagrams. Except Father, who has absolutely nothing on his gate whatsoever. And we will come back to why I think that is. Before we get there, though, we're going to have to pass our way through Jewish psychology. This is basically.
If we're leaving on this Sephiroth for now, another time it shows up briefly. It's in Rental Magica. I'm blanking on her name, but in one of the episodes with the Ghost Girl, you can see most of the images of Sephiroth appear when she uses her power to the fullest, except for the one for memory, which is what she has lost.
I am not familiar with this series at all.
Rental Magica. It's a very good one.
My fiance has also pointed out to me that one of the Digimons has an episode that's full of the Sephiroth and Kabbalistic imagery, and I probably need to watch it, but I have never watched any Digimon, so it'll take a while to get to it.
Quick comment on that. Is Guilty Crown?
Can you speak up a little? I can't hear you.
Guilty Crown. A recent anime. Main character gets the power of a king, and his right arm gets cut off later. I'm not sure if they have any symbolic meaning after hearing him talk, but just thought of speak, because he gets it cut off when he later gets it back. It's like the power that he gets is to kind of see the true form of his soul. I'm not sure if that's any like symbolic meaning.
It very well could be. I don't know. I'd have to see more. Ever since NGE, there's been a steady increase in Kabbalistic imagery in anime, because NGE was wildly successful and incredibly influential, and it had it. So everyone must now have it. Basically, you are now required to either have lots of Christian imagery or lots of Kabbalistic imagery, or both. Occasionally, someone will actually get a little of it right. FMA does an excellent job in that respect.
I think I mentioned this to you on Friday, but I was doing a neo-Victorian project involving D. Grayman. Well, when you said the Sephiroth, and you talked about the right hand and the left hand, it reminded me of the main character, Alan Walker's power emanates from his left hand, but when he actually evolves another step further in his ability, his right hand also gains power, and he has the power to help his friends with the right hand and his power to help Akuma with the left hand, which is essentially to destroy Akuma and free the souls that are trapped in them. So I thought that was interesting when you said that.
That is almost definitely a reference. That's highly specific. So getting into, this is basically how Jewish thought, especially medieval Jewish thought, dealt with the concepts of good and evil and what makes people act the way they do. Basically, you have in you two inclinations: the positive inclination and the negative inclination. The negative inclination are the passions and the desires that make us stray from the righteous path. And all humans, without exception, are born with it. Kabbalah identifies it with the primordial darkness from which God made the world. Whereas the positive inclination, it must be found, it must be learned. Remember when I mentioned the vessels shattering? Every shard became a tiny spark of light in a human soul. And the positive inclination comes from that light, but you have to fan it to life. You have to, it's like a little ember, and you have to blow on it to get a flame. The negative inclination is not evil, however. It is absolutely necessary because, just to give some examples, lust makes love possible. If people did not want to screw each other, there would be no babies and there would be no people. If there was no anger, if there was no rage, if there was no hate, injustice would never be combated and it would be allowed to stand. These are necessary. In a balanced person, the negative inclination is the source of energy, while the positive inclination restrains and guides that energy. The negative inclination is the engine, the positive inclination is the steering wheel and the brakes. You need both to make the car work. If anyone is at all familiar with Freud, he got it from this. He definitely learned this stuff when he was young because he was Jewish and raised Jewish. And he definitely took the id and the superego from this. He just added the ego in between. So let's talk a little about this concept of the negative inclination in FMA. Basically, Father is a being who is trying to get rid of his negative inclination. And that is what the homunculi are. He is trying to purge himself of all, they use the Christian sins, but they're using the Jewish idea of the negative inclination ultimately, where he's trying to purge himself of these things. His envy of humans' light, his greed for human relationships, his gluttonous desire to take people into himself. Because Father is actually a tragic figure. All of his, when you really look at what version of the sins the homunculi represent, he's incredibly lonely. Greed is greedy for people. Envy is envious of people. Gluttony wants to absorb people. Lust is all about bloodlust directed at people. Father is lonely and sad. And my pet theory on Father is that the reason shedding the negative inclination screws him over so badly, partly because you need it, as they point out in the series, but partly because there is nothing to him. He does not have the divine light because he is not a human and does not have a soul. He is my theory is he is a piece of that primordial darkness. And if you'll remember, at the beginning of the universe, there was only light, there was no darkness, and then God retracted. So I think he's a piece of primordial darkness that on some level remembers being light and misses it and wants it back. But he's going about it by the completely wrong method.
Is that why he tries to absorb God?
That is exactly why he tries to get God. He wants the light back in him. Tikkun olam, the essential principle of Jewish ethics. It roughly translates to heal the world or fix the world. As I mentioned earlier, the shattered vessels. Now, God being omnipotent and all-knowing knew the vessels were going to shatter. So the question is, why make something that you know is going to break? Well, that's pretty much how every story starts. Establish the status quo, break it, watch the characters scramble around. That's the plot of history.
So God's a fan fiction.
Basically, yes. The question is, fan fiction of what?
Like, so like a giant game of Sims.
Can we artifact the imagination of ourselves? Or imagination of God's self?
Yeah. And that's actually a common theme in mystical traditions, that, this is one of God's dreams. Basically, the plot of history is to put the world back together. That is what we are here for. That is the ultimate goal. This shows up in a lot of places. This is the plot of NGE. All those shattered pieces of human souls need to be gathered back together and reassemble into the primordial state. And restore the world to the way it was meant to be. If you're familiar at all with the really freaking weird materials they've released about the backstory of NGE, the Red Cross book has some really weird stuff about how Adam and Lilith are sent by aliens throughout the universe to seed life on every planet they find. And they are never supposed to both go to the same planet because they're seeding two different incompatible forms of life. But through an accident, they both ended up on Earth. And all of NGE happens. So again, the world is broken from the beginning, and the plot is to put it back together the way it was meant to be.
Question, which two incompatible forms of life are we talking about? Are we talking about men and women or something else?
No, we're talking about earthly life and angels.
Okay.
Or NGE angels. And then there's Slayers, which is the first anime I ever watched and still has a special place in my heart. Where, again, the world is broken on purpose. Slayers has a lot of visual references to medieval Christian demonology, which drew a lot from Kabbalah, so it would not surprise me if this was actually intentional reference. The world is broken on purpose in Slayers. The Lord of Nightmares, the creator of all things from the primordial chaos, specifically made the world with a balance between good and evil who would fight constantly for her entertainment. There is a great fan theory that the Lord of Nightmares is heresy. I love it. I'm sorry, no, I'm wrong. The Lord of Nightmares did it completely subconsciously. It's not exactly on purpose, but it is intentional because she's doing it subconsciously. She does not actually know how or why she created the universe.
That's even more like Haruhi.
That is even more like Haruhi, I know. God, I'm running through this really quickly. Let's talk. So, we're trying to heal the world. How and who is going to do that? Moshiach. Moshiach is anglicized as Messiah, but I prefer using the Hebrew word because the English word Messiah has been turned into the Christian version, and the Christian Messiah is completely and entirely unlike the Jewish Moshiach. They have absolutely nothing whatsoever in common. Traditionally, Moshiach is a political and military leader who unites the people and brings in a new age. Frequently, this is tied to this idea that there are some fixed numbers. Sometimes it's 12, sometimes it's 120, sometimes it's 70-something, I forget what. But there's a specific number of truly righteous people in every generation. And if they could all be gathered together to work together, the Golden Age would begin. And Moshiach's job is to find and gather them and unite their power. In modern interpretations, Moshiach is often not a military or political leader, but someone who, sometimes it's not even a person in modern interpretations. Moshiach is frequently seen as an age or something we are trying to achieve or become or that kind of thing. And of course, ultimately Moshiach gathers together the shards, heals the world, and restores it to the way it was meant to be. Not personally, but by leading the rest of the world to work together to do it. Anime, I meant him, sorry.
Are you familiar with the plot and metaphysics behind the video game Kingdom Hearts at all?
I played the first game, got tired of the cameraman trying to kill me. Then I played Final Fantasy X and Star Ocean 3 and decided Square Enix was trying to kill me and never touched any game of theirs that wasn't a remake again.
Because especially when you're getting into this the second game and some of the metaphysics that are hinted at in the first game and then in all the expanded portable materials which they spread across all the different systems, which is incredibly frustrating. But looking at it like that, it actually is almost exactly fitting into this mold here. So
It would not. That involves a lot of the same people as FF7, doesn't it?
I don't know beyond the musical producer. I have no idea.
I seem to recall that it does, and it would thus make sense that after, Hey, we use the word Sephiroth a lot in Final Fantasy VII. Maybe we should look up what it is. You had something?
Yeah, the shards you're talking about are the righteous people, correct?
In some things I've read, the shards are specifically the righteous people. In other things I've read, they're everyone, but the righteous people have bigger or brighter ones, or are better at fanning theirs in flame or whatever. It varies from thing I've read. But yeah, basically it's gathering together the righteous people.
Yeah, an anime called The Familiar Zero. Like the final season of it, like the main plot is to gather the like main protagonists, which are like special.
That's a pretty standard.
It is a fairly standard story. Sometimes there's hints that they're referencing it more directly than others. For example, the reference to shining souls in Xenosaga. And sometimes it just comes so close that even though it's a very common story, sometimes it comes so close to this specific version that it's just fun to think, well, maybe.
Let's actually get to the next slide.
Yeah.
I think I know which one of the ones you're talking about.
Let's see.
That one, that's a different line. Nausicaa?
I'm sorry, Nausicaa?
Yeah.
Also Nausicaa, yes. Although Nausicaa is a little more Christian flavored. But yeah, here we have two powerful and unique figures who gather together people who have special souls. And together they wield the power to bring, to save the world. Sailor Moon is, and especially in the form of Princess Serenity, is pretty close. Shimon is spot on perfect because when they combine all these people in the second movie, the result is the primordial man of light. Who of course takes the form of Kamina because what other form would he take?
Running theme for Inax.
Yes, Gynax does really enjoy the primordial man of light. So that is all I have. So does anyone, we've got a good 15 minutes. Does anyone have any questions, comments?
You said you were going to explain why you think the father's gate was planned.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I mentioned at the beginning of the panel I left my notes in my room, so I was doing this off of memory, so I did miss that. The reason Father's Gate is blank is because he has no soul, because he is a piece of primordial darkness.
This isn't really a question, just like a comment.
Those are welcome too.
Something interesting is if you've ever seen the original Ghost in the Shell,
Yes.
during the final battle scene with Kusanagi, the Tree of Life actually is in the museum, like where us building they're fighting it, actually has the Sephiroth on the wall, which is kind of interesting in terms of like the scene where she's basically talking to like the created the ghost in the machine. I think that's interesting that they did that kind of intentionally in that movie as well to indicate how like these things are progressing even in like cyber phases.
Yeah, and that does, and of course she's making contact with the god in the machine.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So again, another significance to that symbol.